Okay. How are y'all? Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Is that better? Same? How's that? Okay? How about now? Is that better? Okay. Did you guys ever hear the one about constipation? No? Because it never came out. What happens when you eat yeast and shoe polish? You rise and shine. Very well done. All right, how do you have a successful solar system party? What's that? Do you plan it around the sun? Or can you just plan it? Very good. All right. Did you guys have a good fall break last week? Nice, huh? And we didn't even have any cyber attacks. We just decided to schedule it. Those of you that have kids know what I'm referring to. Others, no idea. Okay. This is where we're supposed to start. Hopefully you guys got my message yesterday. I think most everybody did. There's a couple of you that I see missed either one of the two pre-quizzes. Again, you have a freebie. So you have a freebie on the pre, and you have a freebie on the post. And no, you can't take your post freebie and use two freebies on the pre's. Does that make sense? So you're going to have two post quizzes due by this Friday. You guys can take those whenever you want. You have the hang of it now. It's open book, open notes, they're timed. There was one of you that submitted, you pushed the envelope, you submitted after 12 o'clock by 6 seconds. Okay, so it doesn't let you, you have to hit the submit button before the deadline. Okay, but I went in, and on this one, I accepted the submission. It was only 6 seconds late. All right, but please don't do that. Make sure that you're watching your phone clock or set a timer, and just start it before 11:30. It's that easy. So then, because what happens when the time expires, it automatically submits for you. So as long as you start it before 11:30, it'll automatically submit for you. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions before we get started? Okay, so we're going to finish out cell injury and death, and then we're also going to queue up inflammation this week. Okay, so we'll finish up cell injury and death today, and then we'll tackle part one of 2 parts of inflammation starting Wednesday. And then we're on a regular schedule, Monday, Wednesday, pretty much for the rest of the semester. I think there's a couple of holidays in there, and we'll talk about those, but we're not going to take another long weekend other than Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, we get a long weekend. We don't have lecture on Wednesday before Thanksgiving, we just have it on Monday. Okay? All right, everybody able to find VB Learn? It looks like it. Everybody's able to get onto the YouTube lectures. So a couple of points. We've got SI that Ryan mentioned today after class. Probably a good time to start getting in the habit of doing SI because we've got pre-quizzes that you could go over because those have closed, and so now we can discuss them. If you email me before the deadline, I'll probably just tell you, hey, let's wait until after the quiz closes. So I don't want to have a lot of discussion, just out of fairness for people that haven't yet finished it. Then you got post quizzes that are coming up due this Friday. One thing that's great about YouTube lecture is I took the week off, so I forgot where we left off, so I had to watch part of the lecture to figure out where to start. And I also get statistics, so I can see how many of you are actually watching the videos, and we're less than 25% of the class, just so you know. Okay, so I'm just giving you all this feedback, these statistics, because I think they might be meaningful. So if you come to me and you say, hey, I'm not doing as well as I would have liked on the post quizzes, or on exam 1, I'm not doing as well as I would like, what can I do? I'm going to ask you some very specific, pointed, maybe rude questions, like, are you coming to class? Right? Are you going to SI? And are you watching the lectures a second time with your notes? And Ryan and I were talking about this, and this is his suggestion, and I completely agree with it. A great way to study is to go over your notes and make sure they're accurate, and you can do that while you're watching the lectures a second time. And you'll be surprised. I mean, there's parts in your notes where it just like turns into a line, right? Because you just went like this, right? And so you can figure out what that line really means. It might be something really important, okay? I know it's hard for me to keep your attention for an hour and 15 minutes. I get it. I've been doing this a long time. So we make these resources available because I want to make sure you have every tool possible to be successful. And some of you need that. Some of you don't, and that's okay. I mean, if you're getting, and there are some of you getting 10 out of 10 on both of those pre-quizzes, awesome. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. It seems to be working, okay? And if you're doing something slightly different than what I'm suggesting, but it's working, don't change it, okay? That's okay. But for those of you that want to make the improvements, there are these tools and resources available so that you can make those improvements. Okay, fair? All right, let's talk about cellular swelling. I gave you some homework that we're going to come to here in a second. But first, I want to talk about this cellular swelling concept. And this was in the category of cell injury. If you remember, it was a while ago. It was like, a week and a half ago. But we were talking about cell injury. And again, the only reason I know that is because I watched the last half of the lecture, figured out where we left off, okay? It's really weird to watch yourself talk. Have you guys ever done that? Videoed yourself and then listened to yourself? Like, the way you sound to you is different than what comes out of the speakers. Like, I don't sound like that. I sound much more like, well, different. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so we're talking about cell injury. And with cell injury, we're going to start talking about what are some of the things that can cause cell injury. We're going to give some examples. And up until this point, we've really only had 3 disease examples, correct? There's only 3 disease examples that I could ask a test question about, for example, up until this point. So what was our first disease example? Barrett esophagus, very good. What was our second one? You can look back, it's okay. It was an ulcer situation, a peptic or a chronic ulcer, very good. It's actually on the heels of Barrett esophagus. And then the third one that we talked about. What was the third clinical condition or a disease? It was a smoker's lung or the emphysema lung, right? It's probably more appropriate to call it emphysema lung than smoker's lung, right? Not all smokers get emphysema. So we're going to start talking today about some other conditions. And I say it that way so that you can kind of maybe compartmentalize how you're going to study, maybe see if there are parallels between the different types of diseases. But when we have cellular swelling, this is a result of cell injury. So the cells become injured and they're going to respond. And one of the things that they do is they start to swell. They take on water. So there's this hydropic change. That means they take on water. They swell. What are they swelling with? Fluid. And inside of the cell, there's what's called a vacuolar change, meaning there's these large open structures that are like compartments, and that's where a lot of water can fill up into. This is a reversible process at some level, and you're going to see on these pictures at the bottom when we explain them, there's a point of no return. But if it swells and the structural architecture remains intact, and then the stimulus or the injury goes away, and it can return back to homeostatic norm, it's considered reversible. But if it swells too much and it fragments the cell membrane, what do you think? You think it's reversible? No. So there's a point of irreversibility, and that foreshadowing, that's this picture on the far lower right. Okay, that's where the cell membrane has been disintegrated. We'll go through these pictures here in a second. Now, if we're talking about at the organ level, right, at the organ level, because organs are made up of tissues and tissues are made up of cells. And so if the cells inside the tissue are swelling, then the organ macroscopically could be affected. And so the organ itself, because of a lot of this water, might start to take on a pale color, right? It's sort of the coloration of that organ is being diluted. Okay? Not at the cellular level, but at the organ level. Again, cells grouped together to make tissues, multiple tissues grouped together to make an organ. So we're talking about macroscopic here. There's an increase in pressure inside of that organ, now back at the cellular level. When the cells swell, now there's what's called turgor pressure. right? Turgor pressure is the same terminology that you learned back in Bio 100, okay, or 101, or 181, 182. Turgor pressure is that pressure of water pressure against the membrane, the cell wall, or the cell membrane in our case, right? Plants have a cell wall, and eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane. And so now those organelles are feeling an internal pressure, and that's a problem. So those organelles could respond to that increase in pressure. Now the overall organ weight is going to be increased. And so this is an important thing. So if you're looking at pathology as a field and you do an autopsy, it's very common for them to take out every single organ and weigh it. And this is one of the reasons they're trying to understand, is that organ have a larger mass than what the normal range is for that normal-sized individual. We have normal-sized male, female ethnicities. We know all of that information, and a pathologist can do an autopsy and say, man, the liver in this individual was like 3 times the weight that it should have been. And all the other organs in the abdominal cavity are within normal range. So something happened with the liver. Does that make sense? So it's going to increase in weight. So let's look at these pictures. We talked about cells, and we talked about these vacuoles that take on the water. Let's take a look at some of these pictures. So at the lower left, these are kidney tubules. So your lower left over here, these kidney tubules, they're cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelium. And the simple cuboidal epithelium looks kind of like a box, and it's got a nucleus inside, and they are one single layer that are adjacent to each other, and they make up a tube. Okay? That's what it's normally supposed to look like. Now, this is a situation where we've got some problems associated with the kidney, and we're getting kidney necrosis taking place, and there's trauma to the kidney because of it. And so that middle picture, you're starting to see early reversible ischemic injury, where we cut off blood supply to the kidney, and now the tissue starts to die, or you have cellular damage. And you can compare these two pictures, and hopefully you can appreciate that this kidney tubule kind of right in the middle doesn't have nearly the architectural organization than all of these over on the left. You can kind of appreciate here it's sort of just falling apart. And then what do you think this picture is that I alluded to in the far lower right? Do you think that's reversible ischemic trauma or damage, or is it non-reversible? It's non-reversible. And why? What's your first clue? We talked about it. So the membrane's gone. Okay? The membrane has been compromised, so now the cells have been destroyed. There's a hole in the membrane. And if there's a hole in the membrane, you lose ionic balance on either side of the plasma membrane, right? You get the leakage of all sorts of enzymes. Everything is messed up and compromised. And so you can kind of, it's hard to appreciate anything that's intact, to be quite honest. Here's actually a structure that looks intact, but it's anuclear. You see how there's no more nuclei present? Those are those purple dots, right? The purple dots are eosin. And the pink stain is what? Hematoxylin. I thought I heard it over here. So H and E, hematoxylin, eosin. You're going to see a lot of H and E pictures throughout the semester. Okay. Another thing that can happen during cell injury is there could be a change in the fatty content. So I talked about those vacuoles, and they can fill with water. Those vacuoles can actually fill with fat. Okay? And so there's an increase in lipogenesis, meaning the production of fat, or there's a compromised ability to make energy from fat, or what's known as lipolysis. So this is a classic example of liver tissue. And the upper picture, right, again, hematoxylin and eosin stain, right? The pink is the pink is the eosin, and the hematoxylin is the purple dots, or the nuclei. You can see the normal architecture, the lobule, the different zones 1, 2, and 3, the pleural triad right here. And look at down low in comparison. Normal up top, I would label these normal, and I would label this fatty liver or cirrhotic liver. Okay? Liver disease or an alcoholic liver. And so what happens is all of these circular globules are these vacuoles that are filled with fat. And so there's a fatty change associated with this liver after repetitive chemical injury. So in the previous example, right, we were talking about the injury was what? What was the injury that caused this progression from left to right? Ischemia. Ischemia. What is ischemia? Okay, so it's caused by a loss of blood flow, right? And then the tissue has less what inside of it? Oxygen. Okay? So ischemic tissue has compromised blood flow that doesn't bring enough oxygen to it, and now it becomes ischemic. So that was the stimulus that caused this one. This one, what's the injury? It's not ischemia, it's what? Chemical injury in the form of what? Alcohol, if it's an example of an alcoholic liver. It is reversible, that's the good news. We'll talk more about this clinical example in our liver and renal sections. And the reason this is reversible is you can actually use that fat to generate energy if it's stored well, and as long as there's no scar tissue in the liver, or what we call fibrotic tissue, or lesions, then it's reversible. Once the liver scars, it's non-reversible. We're going to talk a little bit more of that when we talk about healing and repair, okay, in the next couple of weeks. And we're going to talk about normal healing that leads to complete restoration of function of the tissue. And we're going to talk about wound healing, where you lay down fibrotic tissue in the form of what's called a scar, and you lose the function of the original tissue, but there's not a giant gaping hole. And all of you know this, like you've fallen off your bike, fell off a skateboard, okay, cut your chin playing beer pong or whatever it is, and there's a scar that forms on the skin, right? And it's stiffer, it's not as elastic. You know, some of you actually have scars where you like, you know, maybe cut open your head, you fell off and cut open your head, but they had to sew stuff, you know, back together, and the hair doesn't grow back in that area, right? So there's no more functionality of that skin tissue. So as long as there's no scar tissue, this will reverse, okay? So two different examples now. Ischemic injury, or a loss of blood flow causing kidney remodeling. And then here with an alcoholic situation, we get a fatty liver change. Let's see if I want to talk about anything else. Okay, so now let's talk about apoptosis or apoptosis, right, depending upon how you pronounce it. We're getting to that picture that was your homework. Do you guys remember your homework? Okay, it's coming up. So apoptosis is known as programmed cell death. And you can see on the right side of the screen over here, we can see this pathway of apoptosis, programmed cell death. And we talked about reasons that apoptosis are valuable. So who can share with me one of those examples that we introduced the last time we were together?
It's apoptosis of the cells, so you have like make fingers separate.
Yeah, so the tissue in between your digits actually dies off in utero, and now you form individual digits. Okay? Very important. We're going to start talking later in the semester about the immune system, and we're going to talk about the thymus, right? An organ that sits just above the heart, kind of in the throat region. And that's where T cell maturation takes place. And so another example of apoptosis is within the thymus. Most of the T cells that you make for your immune system actually are scheduled for programmed cell death. Most of the immune cells that are T cells that you manufacture are actually programmed for cell death. Here's why. They're self-reactive. So the immune system plays this game where they say, okay, let's create all these different combinations of T cells that are the cells that are going to go attack a foreign object. Let's be as creative as possible to brainstorm about all the different types of invaders. It would be like if you're trying to protect Earth and you're trying to think of all the different invaders that can come from out of Earth's atmosphere. Okay, you're going to get super creative. Well, every now and then you're going to come up with ideas where what if they have 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and hair? And it kind of looks like all of us. And so if it reacts to your own cells, you will program it for death. Does that make sense? So that's the reason. We'll talk more about that later. But I just want to give you a little understanding as to why you would make T cells and then destroy them. You make them because you want to be as creative about all the permutations that you might come across, but inevitably in so doing, you create a number of them, a lot of them, that are self-reactive. So you schedule them for programmed cell death. But programmed cell death means, or cell suicide is another way to describe it, it's actually written that way in the literature, cell suicide, you recycle a lot of those parts. And so it's organized, okay? It's tidy. It happens through a very specific process over time. And so you can see on the left side of the slide that the cell slowly gets a little bit smaller. And you kind of compartmentalize off these apoptotic bodies, and then some other cell nearby phagocytoses it and adopts those cell fragments and recycles them. So it's a very organized, let's get rid of this particular cell. So you don't lose everything. Now in contrast, on this side is necrosis, which is where we've been spending most of our time. And necrosis is a process that's very unorganized. It's not clean, it's not tidy. The cell enlarges and swells, and then at some point it perforates. The fragment, the cell membrane becomes fragmented. Kind of like those kidney tubules that we looked at with that hematoxylin eosin stain picture. Okay? That's an example of necrotic process. But we're going to characterize different categories of necrosis, and hopefully you've already looked at that, so you know what's coming. Some pretty yucky pictures, right? But we're going to talk about how we categorize necrosis, even clinically. Like many of you are clinically focused, and you're going to talk about different types of necrosis as you treat your patients. So apoptosis, organized, you get this blooding, the membrane stays intact. And it was originally described in 1842, okay, by Carl Vogt, V-O-G-T, German scientist. Okay, so let's look at this comparison table. Wonderful comparator. You've got apoptosis on your left, and you've got necrosis on your right. And so you can see that apoptosis is single cell targeting. Now, a whole group of cells could have the same signal, and they could all be going through apoptosis, but it starts with a single cell. Necrosis usually affects a group of neighboring cells because in our example of reduced blood flow to a tissue, there's a lot of cells that are going to be impacted by that reduction of blood flow. Okay? We've got no inflammatory response, and we've got a significant inflammatory response with necrosis. We get cell shrinkage with apoptosis. It gets smaller over time, and we've got cellular swelling as it takes on water, or in the case of our fat example, it kind of takes on fat bodies in those vacuoles. We've got membrane blooding, but it remains intact. You lose the membrane, it looks moth-eaten, is another way to describe it. We increase mitochondrial membrane permeability over here, releasing these pro-apoptotic proteins. The organelles swell, and the lysosomes leach or leak out on necrosis. We've got condensation of the DNA on apoptosis, and on necrosis, you just have degradation. Here's another example of apoptosis that's helpful is if you have detectable DNA damage, like missing base pairs or transcription errors or transposition errors, like instead of an adenosine, you have a cytosine. A lot of times that's enough to trigger that cell into an apoptotic cycle. And so your body checks it, the integrity of the DNA, and it says, you know what? We'll get to this in the cancer section, okay, with P53. So if you have trauma to your DNA, like you get too much sun, okay, too much radiation, chemical exposure, and your body detects that there's a transposition error in a nucleotide or a base pair, it'll signal that cell for apoptosis. Okay, so this is a normal, healthy thing. In necrosis, it's random degradation. Over here, it condenses so that you might be able to reuse it. Apoptosis, you got apoptotic bodies. That's a classic clue that you're dealing with apoptosis. And then over here, you've got lyse cells that are phagocytosed or ingested by scavenger cells, phagocytic cells known as macrophages. Okay, so here's the homework. This leads up to what I wanted you guys to look at. Okay, you guys remember looking at this? Maybe talk with your neighbor, compare notes. Some of you are like, homework. So it's not going to be graded. That's what you're not turning anything in. I just wanted you to look at this and be thinking about it over your fall break. So if you didn't do that, think about it now. Tell me which one of these is a picture of necrosis, which one is a picture of apoptosis, and then defend it. So turn to your neighbor, share and compare, and then defend why your answer is what it is. Okay. We got a bold volunteer? Right here.
I'm gonna say A is apoptosis and B is necrosis because you have lack of membrane integrity on the right, and then on the left you have that characteristic blooding green like apoptotic bodies.
Pretty bulletproof example or explanation, right? So B says that B is necrosis because you have lost the integrity of the membrane. You can see all the holes in it. In A, you have the classic example of an apoptotic body coming like right out you, right, where it's blooding out. Okay? They're not always this clear, but makes sense? Pretty straightforward. You can compare and contrast the two. Anybody disagree or have a question?
Well, I just have a question. What's the difference between blebbing and then swelling?
Yeah, what's the difference between blebbing and swelling? So swelling is the overall cell is going to enlarge, and blebbing is the cell will slowly start to decrease, and you're going to get these little pouches that come out, like these little, puckerings, and then they'll pinch off and leave. And as they pinch off and leave, the remaining mass just gets a little bit smaller each time. Good question. It's about 5,000 x magnification on an SEM of two different cells, same magnification view. And so you can see that that's probably on the left, the first apoptotic body, because they're about the same size, right? And the first apoptotic body is coming out. And that picture of that cell on the right, over here, is just completely traumatized from a membrane standpoint. So you've lost everything. So that will become very important when you talk about who cares so much about losing the membrane. We're going to talk about all the downstream events at the end of the lecture. Okay, so back to necrosis. We were talking about cell injury. We talked a lot about necrosis. We introduced apoptosis, and now we're back into necrosis. So necrosis is irreversible once that membrane gets compromised. It's largely due to the degradation activities from enzymes that are held within the cell itself. So the cell kind of chews itself up. This is a larger view of kidney necrosis, or kidney coagulative necrosis, as it's labeled. Kidney coagulative necrosis, and that specific terminology will become a little bit more clear here in a minute. But you can see that you've got no more purple dots, right? It's all eosin stained. There's no more hematoxylin. So all of these circle structures that are your tubules are anuclear. So we've lost all the nucleus. Even though some of the architecture is still there, the tissue is starting to fall apart. Okay, generally speaking, if we're talking about cell injury or tissue injury, we're going to be talking about necrosis. When we want to talk about apoptosis, you'll hear the term apoptosis or programmed cell death. Does that make sense? So generally speaking, that's a good rule of thumb. Most of the diseases that we're gonna come in contact with where there's cell injury, we're talking about necrosis. Every now and then we'll talk about apoptosis, but you'll know it because there'll be a heads up. We're talking about programmed cell death, we're talking about apoptosis. This is not a necrotic response. Okay, so that's kind of the general rule of thumb. So, in that vein, let's talk about the different categories of necrosis. And you had some of these questions already on the pre-quiz, so hopefully you either took a look at the slides, because some of these slides would have answered the pre-quiz question right for you, or you watched last year's lecture. I walked by upstairs this morning and I saw that some of you were out watching last year's lecture in the lobby upstairs, presumably getting ready to take the exam. Nothing wrong with that. That's why I could delete them if I didn't want you doing that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's smart. Use every tool you got. So last year, lectures are still there until I put this year's, and I'm trying to put this year's with a 19 after it, or like an F19, so you can see where the new stuff is from the old. It should be pretty obvious, but just in case if you're going quickly. Does that make sense? So coagulative necrosis. A lot of these categories of necrosis are named historically because of either the way that they express or the organs that they affect. So kidneys, heart, adrenal glands, all develop this coagulative necrosis response. And the fundamental reason for it is because of the way a vascular tree goes into a tissue. So if you've got a vascular tree or a branching vascular bed, right, so blood vessels and blood flow is coming this way, you with me? And then you have an injury or you turn off blood flow, that didn't show up very well. You turn off blood flow to that tissue here, the area that's affected in that organ is going to follow the architecture of the vascular tree. And so you can see that it's going to create essentially a wedge. And that's the definition of coagulative. So all of these organs that are listed are kidneys, heart, adrenal glands. They all tend to form a wedge-like necrotic scar. So you can see on this picture here, this is the spleen. So that's another organ you could add to the list. This is the spleen. And you can see that there's a old scar, and then there's a new scar right here. And you can see that this is a wedge shape. This is also a wedge shape. And this might remodel to be more wedge-like this one. You know this is older because of how pale in color it is. This is all fibrotic tissue. This is kind of blanched, so it doesn't have the same coloration, right, as the normal spleen next to it, but it hasn't gone completely fibrotic. Make sense? So the proteins denature in all of these necrotic types of situations. That just means that they break down. And this is secondary, coagulative necrosis is secondary to acute ischemia. So what that terminology means is you have a reduction in blood flow, and then the tissues become ischemic, and then you develop necrosis. So secondary to acute ischemia means acute ischemia happens first, and then second is necrosis. Make sense? The scar formation that's left behind is this fibrotic lesion. And this will become more studied for us when we get into wound healing in about 2 weeks. So let's look at some examples. Coagulative necrosis, an infarcted kidney. Hold your question for 1 second, I'll come back. It is an infarcted kidney. And some of you are like, okay, well, what does a normal kidney look like? This is a normal kidney. This is off of the digital histology DVD. Like I promised you, if I use pictures, they'll be on the screen. And every picture that's on the screen is fair game on the exam. You guys remember that, right? So let's look at a side-by-side comparison. I'm going to dim the lights for you. Yep. There it is. Okay, so we've got normal kidney on the left, and you can see the notifiable structures known as the glomeruli, right? That's these round tufts. See all these little round tufts? They're much more easy to see over here in the infarcted kidney because they're all scar tissue now. They're no longer functional glomeruli. And what does the glomeruli do? You guys remember back to 202? It filters blood to make what? Ultimately urine, but filtrate, that's the more accurate terminology. Doesn't really become urine until further downstream. So you've got this interface of these tufts of blood vessels that are very leaky. And then you've got the tubular network that reabsorbs. And then everything that doesn't get reabsorbed basically leaves as filtrate, right? And so you can kind of appreciate where the normal glomeruli are located and then where the infarcted glomeruli are located. If we were to look at the kidney like the spleen, you would see a lesion that looks like a wedge. Question?
Oh man, what's the question? Oh yeah, is coagulative necrosis only from ischemia? Infarction?
Good question. Is coagulative necrosis only caused, well, I'm going to rephrase it, only caused by ischemia? No, not necessarily. So most oftentimes that's how it gets there. You lose blood flow. But you could have trauma to the organ, and then it would follow, the shape of the steering wheel or whatever it was that blunt force trauma to the organ. Okay. Then it would deviate from a wedge shape in that situation. But that's a really good question. Okay. Next one up, liquefactive necrosis. So this is a coronal slice through the brain. So you can see patient's right hemisphere, patient's left hemisphere. You can see the division between the two hemispheres right down here. And then you can see our lateral ventricles and then the third ventricle. Makes sense? Those are those openings where cerebrospinal fluid flows. And then where is the liquefactive necrosis? Pretty obvious? Describe it to me using directional terms, anatomical terms. Superior lateral aspect of which hemisphere? The left. Okay? So you kind of see this discoloration that happens here. So liquefactive necrosis is it's caused by the neurons and the glial cells of the brain being high in hydrolytic enzymes and also lipids, a lot of fat. The brain itself has very little connective tissue. There's a lot of connective tissue in coagulative type of organs. And so here you get a lot of digestion that's happening because of these hydrolytic enzymes. And so it liquefies the lesion and then it becomes walled off. Okay. Characteristics, it's irregular, it's not wedge shaped. It may be round or ovoid in architecture. Often there's an empty space. If you take that tissue out and you try to section it and do histology, there's going to be a lot of empty space in the middle because there's not much tissue integrity to hold it together. Liquefactive necrosis heals very slowly if it heals at all. Unlike coagulative necrosis where you get a scar that forms very prominently. And there's a lot of times where you'll get liquefactive necrosis where you get pus formation, or what's called a pyogenic infection. And this is typically due to the bacterial infections that are present that make up the pus. All right, our next one up, third category, is caseous necrosis. This is probably the most disgusting out of all of them. Caseous necrosis has an appearance of like cheese. The tissue looks kind of cheesy, big chunky cheese in a way. This is, the top image is a lung that's infected with tuberculosis. And there's caseous necrosis in the middle containing this yellow-white cheesy debris. Right here. It's really kind of a combo between coagulative and liquefactive. So it has some characteristics of both. The bottom image, you can kind of appreciate where there's a chest x-ray, and we've got tuberculosis in this lung, and we've kind of highlighted in the lung where we're looking, and then here is the lesion in the black arrows. They're highlighting the caseous necrosis lesion, which would be like what you see here, just slightly smaller. Okay, so on x-ray, these will show up, and they're showing up as kind of these open spaces where there's not much tissue because it's kind of falling apart. This is another section here of a lymph node, and this lymph node is dying or dead, wasting away, infected with tuberculosis, and there's a caseous necrotic tissue that makes up that center lymph node. This one's rather interesting, the next category, the fourth one, known as fat necrosis. So fat necrosis targets organs that are heavy in fat content, like breasts, pancreatic tissue, other abdominal organs. Lots of lipases that are found within the abdominal cavity. Pancreatic lipases are being released by the pancreas all the time. So this particular tissue here is the pancreas with areas of fat necrosis throughout. So these are the little white nodules that you see. Pancreatic tissue with all of these lesions known as necrotic or fat necrosis of the pancreas. So what's going on with fat necrosis? Well, the lipases, these are enzymes that digest fat. The lipases themselves are being released due to damaged tissue, and they digest the triglycerides that are present in the tissue. That releases free fatty acids that bind with calcium that's present in the tissue, extracellular calcium, extracellular magnesium, and extracellular sodium. So calcium, magnesium, and sodium find free fatty acids that are the breakdown products of fat. And that is how you make soap, if you didn't know. It's called saponification. So you get fat, you add an enzyme, you get free fatty acids, you add a little magnesium, a little calcium, and a little sodium, and you get hard ivory soap. Okay? So these nodules on the pancreas, upon palpation, would feel like bumps or lumps, little hard, firm pieces of soap. If this happens in breast tissue on physical exam, it's very often that the patient misdiagnoses as maybe a lump. Okay, and then we'll go in for a mammogram or a biopsy, depending upon what they see on the mammogram. But fat necrosis of breast tissue as women age is relatively common. And it's probably one of the most number one reasons for misdiagnosis. Okay? But it's better to be safe than sorry, right? So they'll misdiagnose, there's some sort of lesion that's happening there because the tissue is just aging. Remember, age is a disease. And so there's a lump that's felt on self-exam. They go to the physician says, let's get a picture, says, oh, it looks fine, or wow, it does look pretty dense, because these will come up calcified lesions. Remember, there's calcium there. They'll come up on mammogram as being a dense lesion. Depending upon the size, they may or may not go in and take a biopsy or remove it. So fat necrosis is one of the most common ways or reasons that we have misdiagnoses of breast cancer on physical exam. But I guess the misdiagnosis is good news, not bad news. Okay, sort of our last category here, but technically speaking, scientifically speaking, it's not really a type of necrosis. This is more of a clinical category that's slung around in clinical environments all the time. But for the most part, it's going to be a coagulative, or in some cases it might be fat necrosis. Other cases it might be caseous necrosis or liquefactive. So it's going to fall really in some of the other categories, but because it's so commonly used, we kind of pull it out in this class all on its own. So it's really a clinical term, and we've got two different types of gangrenous necrosis, or gangrene is what you've heard. This is death of tissue due to severe hypoxic injury. Could happen with an atherosclerotic blockage. Lower legs are very common for this to take place, or distal extremities like feet and toes, as you see in this example. So dry gangrene is a result of coagulative necrosis. The tissue shrinks and it becomes black or brown, and that's what you see in this picture right here. That's dry gangrene. Okay. But really, it's at the root a coagulative type of response. Now on the exam, if I showed this picture, am I going to try to trick you, like, is it dry gangrene or is it coagulative? No, I won't do that. Okay, I'll only give you one of those answers, for example. I'm not going to try intentionally to throw you off. Does that make sense? Now, I just want to, guide you. If you go to medical school and you're a first-year resident, it's probably not cool to correct the attending physician, right? Well, technically, that's not gangrene, doc. Right? You'll probably lose that opportunity really fast. But just know, this is a type of coagulative necrosis. It's just in the clinic, physicians like to refer to it as gangrene. Now, there's another type of gangrene, which is wet gangrene, which is really liquefactive necrosis. And this is usually affecting internal organs. They become swollen, cold, black. They're foul in odor. There's a lot of pus. So this happens like with bowels. When you have limited blood perfusion to the intestines, you're going to get a wet gangrenous response in the intestines. And then the last type of gangrene is known as gas gangrene. Gas gangrene, it's hard to say, is due to a Clostridium infection, usually anaerobic type of bacteria. And then that releases a lot of gas, and that's where it gets its name from. These gas bubbles form. So the last clinical picture before we transition to the next section, again, this is from the DVD, showing normal plantar skin, which is a beautiful slice here. Okay, this is normal plantar skin. Just to refresh your memory, I'm kind of a histology nerd, just in case you're curious. So I really do like histology, but this one is really quite pretty. I threatened to blow this up and put it over our couch in the living room, but my wife overruled me. So you can see, some of you might say this is upside down. Just think of it like at the bottom of the foot. Right? This is outside environment, stratum corneum, that nice little purple layer, stratum lucidum layer, and then the darker nucleated layer is granulosum, and then you get your stratum basale, which is that interface between the dermis and the epidermis. The epidermis dermal interjunction is this sort of undulated ridge. Now we're going to blow up the dermal tissue here and take a look at this. This is nothing like you would expect it to look like, because this is gangrenous skin, like on the bottom of the foot, and this is normal skin on the bottom of the foot. You can see how open this is. You can see that there are nuclei, but the dermis is actually matrix rich and cell poor. You guys remember that from 201 probably? So it has a lot of matrix, but it doesn't have as many cells. So you do have nuclei, again, hematoxylin and stain. All the purple dots are the nuclei. Well, look at all these purple dots, okay? What are those cells? What are those cells? So this is the microscopic view. That's the macroscopic view. That is not a biopsy from that patient's foot, just for full disclosure. It's just an example. But we're going macro and micro. So any speculation on what all those cells are? Any idea? We're getting into inflammation. I asked you to read chapter 2. I think you're going to want to read chapter 2 before Wednesday. They're lymphocytes. They're not lymphocytes, but you're very close. You're in the right. I like what you're thinking. Leukocytes. What type of leukocytes specifically? Neutrophils. Wow. Okay. She got really warmer. You're getting warmer. You're getting warmer. She was red hot. These are neutrophils that are infiltrating immediately. And then the second round of cells that will infiltrate are known as macrophages. And these are a type of white blood cell or a leukocyte. Okay? So remember that when we start talking on Wednesday about inflammation. I want you guys to see pictorially how impressive this response is that happens. Because your body is trying to respond. Okay. Questions on that? All right, so more on that Wednesday. But next up, we need to start talking about some of the cell injury specifics. And this is where we're going to get into some of the mechanisms. We're not going to rush through this, I promise. I think we're going to have plenty of time today to finish. We'll take it slow. And when I throw up, pardon, I'm not going to throw up. When I demonstrate certain slides like this, you want to throw up because you're like, holy smokes, there's a lot going on there. So let's just take it one at a time, okay? This is a great place for you to take notes. You can draw, you can circle, right? If you're like, oh crap, I forgot to print these out. Good news is you can rewatch it with your printed out lectures and make your notes and your diagrams tonight. You can fast forward to this part of the lecture, okay? So you see how you can use the lecture material or the online lecture material? Okay, so quickly, you've got an injury up top, and then we're going to have responses down low. The injury up top is either going to do one of two things. It's either going to lead to necrosis, or in some special cases, it's going to lead to apoptosis. That's the summary of this whole slide. In the special case of apoptosis, you can see when the damage is happening to the DNA, and you get accumulation of proteins that are not folded correctly. That's a signal to your body to say, let's just signal this cell for death and start all over. Let's recycle all the parts, let's try it again. Okay, so that takes care of this side. But I told you, most oftentimes in this class, we're going to be dealing with necrosis. Look at all the things that happen. There's only 3 things that are being characterized. We can have damage to the membrane, or we can have cytoskeletal damage. Now, damage to the membrane is going to trigger a number of different cascade of events. You compromise the plasma membrane, so you lose cellular components. You compromise lysosomes that hold enzymes. They dump their contents and digestion starts. That's where those lipases come from. We talk about pancreatic lipases in the case of fat necrosis. You're like, where did the lipases come from? Well, they're sitting in lysosomes inside of the pancreas. And when the membrane is compromised on the outside of the cell, the lysosome is compromised and it dumps its content, and then it just starts digesting the tissue away. You cause damage to the mitochondria. The mitochondria are what? What does the mitochondria do? The powerhouse of the cell. I love that. Like it's like the little, nickname you give it like in, 8th grade or in high school, and you never forget it, right? It's such a great nickname. The powerhouse of the cell is responsible for manufacturing ATP. If you lose the mitochondria, you lose your energy source. Tell me, if this is off menu, right? We're ordering off menu now, it's not listed here. But what is one result of a loss in ATP that's critical to homeostasis of a cell? Can you guys give me just one example? What's that? Ion pumps. Nailed it. Love that. Do you lose energy? You cannot keep your ionic balance where it's supposed to be. You guys remember that whole I can't remember if it was 3 in or 2 in or 2 out, or sodium goes one way, potassium, right? You guys remember that? In this class, good news, you're not going to have to remember it. I just want you to be able to appreciate that there's something important about having a membrane and having a high concentration of sodium outside and a high concentration of potassium inside, right? And what allows that gradient to be that way is ion pumps. Well, you lose ATP, you can't keep your sodium potassium ATPase running, so you lose your potential. Okay, next up, 2 things that can happen. Either the cell can perform an activity on itself, known as autophagy, or a nearby cell can perform an activity, which is called heterophagy. Okay? So, it's dependent on the type of injury. It's dependent upon the severity, like how big of a deal it is. And it's also dependent upon how long it's been since the injury took place. So let's just take take a look at autophagy. Auto meaning self. So autophagy, you can see that here's some organelles, here's a primary lysosome, this is a mitochondria that gets packaged in this lysosome. Now it's an autophagic vacuole, and it fuses with a lysosome that dumps enzymes into it and digests it, and then it excretes it. And so in this example on autophagy, the cell itself packages the recycled part in a vacuole, and then it fuses it with a lysosome that contains enzymes, and then it digests the tissue and dumps it out so somebody else can use it. Heterophagy. The particle is ingested from another cell, and the same process takes place, and then it dumps its contents via exocytosis. Make sense? So in both of these cases, you're scavenging up stuff. And a cell that primarily is going to be this heterophagic type of cell, you can write up here an example. A great example is the macrophage. Okay, the tissue macrophage. And there's a little symbol. That means macrophage. I think it'd be a super cool tattoo. If anybody wants to borrow it, okay. All I ask is just put my initials underneath it. Give me credit for it, okay. But that would be a great tattoo. I mean, that is a cool looking symbol for the macrophage. Okay, so if you're reading primary text, you might see that symbol as macrophage. I'm kidding. I'm not trying to have a kid get a tattoo, but I'm just trying to keep some people away. Okay. So the process that's taking place here, backing it all up to the prior picture, is we've got trauma to these cell parts, these organelles. So you can see that altered mitochondria or cytoskeletal changes, the cell is going to either respond on its own or a nearby cell is going to do something. And if it's a nearby cell that does it, it's probably going to be the tissue macrophage. Okay? We'll learn more about the tissue macrophage Wednesday and next week. Okay. Let's take a look at hypoxia. Okay, we talked about ischemia. Now let's talk about hypoxia. So let's define some of these terms. So ischemia and then hypoxia. Two really important terms for you to know the difference. So hypoxia refers to oxygen levels being low. So low O2, that's hypoxia. Ischemia is really referring to a restriction in blood flow to the tissues. So this is low blood flow. So, as we talked about earlier, if blood supply to an organ is compromised, there's an ischemic situation that eventually leads to hypoxic tissues. Okay? So with hypoxia, you get what's called a chronic adaptation, meaning that over long terms of time, with hypoxia, you're going to have a decrease in the metabolic rate. The tissue is going to try to conserve energy by lowering metabolism. Because you can understand that if you've got low O2, this means low ATP, correct? That's why blood flow is so important. Because if blood flow is compromised, oxygen levels in the tissue go down. Oxygen levels in the tissue go down. Aerobic respiration produced ATP is gone. If you guys remember back to some of your basic chem classes, the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, that's where you get most of your ATP production. Through glycolytic pathways, you net 2. Whereas with, depending upon how you count, with Krebs and ETC, bless you, you're going to get somewhere between 32 and 36 ATP, right? So there's a huge difference here. So this is why blood flow is so important. So in medicine, when you guys are trying to treat problems with blood flow or blood flow is stopped, you've got a very short amount of time to reestablish blood flow. Otherwise, you're going to get cell injury and necrosis. Okay, so back to our kidney tubule example. We're like killing it with the kidney tubule today. Normal kidney tubule up top, hypoxic injury leading to a coagulative necrosis reorganization due to a loss of oxygen. All right, so if you haven't been convinced yet, let's go a little bit further, okay? And this is where we had an answer already. I want to see, I want to fill out the rest of the answers because it's not just ionic flow that's a problem or the ion pump failure. That is absolutely true. There's a bunch of things happening here. So you can see up here at the very top, ischemia, got a blockage. And so this picture is trying to illustrate, cartoon format is trying to illustrate, hey, you've got blood flowing into the tissue, there's some sort of blockage, and now you've got distal blood flow compromised. So now at the level of the mitochondria, we can't make ATP anymore because oxidative phosphorylation is compromised. Krebs cycle electron transport chain, that's the same thing as oxidative phosphorylation, right? Or tricarboxylic acid cycle plus the electron transport, or aerobic respiration, whatever you want to call it, all of those terminologies mean oxidative phosphorylation. So you can't make energy via what? Oxygen is the final electron acceptor. Thank you. So now ATP is dropped. Here's our sodium pump goes away. You got an influx of calcium, water, and sodium. You got an efflux of potassium. This leads to swelling of the endoplasmic reticulum, and you get the cells swelling themselves, and you just lose out on tons of things. ATP is compromised. Anaerobic glycolysis goes up. Your cell's going to try to compensate. It's going to give a fight. But it nets 2 ATP every time you run the thing. So because you have anaerobic glycolysis going up, you're going to have a bunch of acid being formed, right? Lactic acid, that lowers your pH, and that starts clumping your DNA, okay? Lactic acid goes up, it clumps the DNA. And with an increase in glycolysis activity, you burn up any storage forms of glucose, which are known as glycogen, because you're trying to keep glycolysis running. Make sense? And then over here, you lose ATP, you detach your ribosomes, and protein synthesis is compromised. So, pretty busy slide, but if you walk through it step by step, it actually should make total sense. And to me, this is like kind of a really nerdy, kind of cool moment in time, because there's like 5 different classes that go into this one slide. You guys know what I'm talking about? Like, we have just synthesized all the prerequisite classes that you've taken over the years, and you're like, who freaking cares about the citric acid cycle? Like, am I ever really going to need to know this stuff? Well, maybe not at the level, and no intermediate on the Krebs cycle is going to be on the exam. But what hopefully you're understanding is, wow, it actually really is important that there's a difference between aerobic respiration and glycolysis. And now I understand why aerobic respiration is so important pathologically, because if you lose blood flow and you lose oxygen as a final electron acceptor, then your ability to produce ATP, which is what we really care about, right, is gone. And now that's where a lot of this trauma and damage takes place. Okay, so we got a decreased mitochondrial activity. It lowers what? What does it lower? ATP goes in that blank. Sodium, potassium pump failure. You get calcium influx. You get water. You get the loss of potassium. Okay, bad stuff. And that's how it happens. Okay, so some of you are like, okay, I understand why sodium, potassium is a problem, but what about calcium? Why is calcium such a bad thing? Well, what calcium does is shown on this slide. Calcium, increased cytosolic calcium, stimulates all of this row of ACEs. ATPases, phospholipases, proteases, and endonucleases. Anything that ends in an ACE is an enzyme, typically, which is a type of a protein, and it's going to chew stuff up. So ATPases chew up any ATP that's stored or there. Phospholipases break down the membrane because it's a phospholipid bilayer. Proteases break down proteins. The cytoskeletal architecture that keeps the cell in its shape is compromised. That also collapses the membrane. It's like if you looked in the attic in your house and there weren't any trusses, that's what the cytoskeleton does, is kind of keep the roof up. And then endonucleases, this actually gets into the nucleus if you get damage to your DNA. All right, let's talk next about reactive oxygen species. So reactive oxygen species are a very interesting phenomenon. They occur normally, and normally we are prepared to deal with them. So for example, you can see over on the left a whole laundry list of stuff that's going to cause trauma or damage. And this is a picture of the mitochondria, okay? And you've got oxygen coming in, and any kind of trauma in the form of inflammation, radiation, chemicals, or what we know as reperfusion injury, which is a long story, but what you need to know about reperfusion injury is if you turn off blood flow to a tissue and then you turn it back on, you get this reperfusion of blood that floods it with new oxygen, and it had none, it was starved, and that actually causes an injurious response. Okay, that's reperfusion injury. So in the mitochondria, when oxygen is hit with some of like inflammation or radiation, it creates this superoxide. This intermediate hydrogen peroxide is how we deal with it. We push the Fenton reaction to a hydroxy radical. This hydroxy radical is what's known as a reactive oxygen species. Now, our body has many ways to deal with ROSs, or reactive oxygen species. You can see that we've got antioxidant mechanisms. And so some of you are very diet savvy, right? And so you like foods that are rich in antioxidants. And there is some science behind it. I mean, the reason that we want antioxidants is to scavenge up free radicals, or things that are known as reactive oxygen species. Another name for ROSs are free radicals. But we're pretty well equipped for removing free radicals without some, funky kale smoothie. But they're not bad for you, and there's some science behind having lots of blueberries. SOD is found in the mitochondria, and I have to look up what that refers to because I never remember the name. Something oxide dismutase. 1 second. Superoxide dismutase. There it is. Superoxide dismutase, SOD. This converts O2 to this hydrogen peroxide. So that's this right here. Oh, I should have known that. Superoxide dismutase right there. Glutathione peroxidase converts the OH back to hydrogen peroxide. And then the catalase converts hydrogen peroxide to water and oxygen, which you basically just exhale. Okay? So this is how your body handles free radicals. Now, if you have a kale smoothie with some blueberries, maybe you have some extra free radical scavengers in your diet, which isn't a bad thing. But we're well equipped to deal with it. But if the damage is too large, right? If the trauma is too great, then we may not be able to keep up with the amount of free radical formation that's present in that tissue. And that's where the smoothie might come in handy, okay? But if you don't have a smoothie, look at what can take place. Reactive oxygen species, they oxidize fatty acids, okay? They oxidize proteins, and they oxidize DNA. Anytime you oxidize any of these things, bad stuff's going to happen. Oxidizing DNA causes mutations. Oxidizing proteins loses their activity. They're no longer functional. And then oxidizing fatty acids disrupts their architecture, so like the plasma membrane and organelles are no longer operational. So, a reactive oxygen species that is a disease state, another disease state, we've talked about a few of them today. This is known as acetaminophen poisoning. So this is cell injury that happens to the liver. And the population that's most commonly affected, unfortunately, are pediatric patients. Because well-meaning mom and dad are trying to manage cold symptoms as well as fevers. And Tylenol is the name brand, but acetaminophen is the generic. Acetaminophen is a great fever reducer, and it's a pain suppressant. So kids, like my nephew was here this weekend, and I think he's got the flu or something, and he was laying on the couch, he felt horrible. We gave him some Tylenol, and like 20 minutes he's out running around. Right? I mean, it works. It's like it's almost as good as a Band-Aid. Seriously, like Band-Aids and Tylenol. If you're gonna be parents in the future, stock up on Band-Aids and Tylenol. But unlike Band-Aids, Tylenol can be very dangerous, okay? I guess if the kid eats a Band-Aid, it's not good, but Tylenol poisoning or acetaminophen poisoning is free radicals that form as a result of an intermediate that's poisonous to hepatocytes or liver cells. So what you see here is a picture of healthy liver and then necrotic liver on the lower right. You can kind of see this transition zone that kind of runs diagonally across the screen. So normally, what's listed here, the liver is going to detoxify acetaminophen by a number of different mechanisms, okay? So there's 3 pathways that normally Tylenol or acetaminophen is got rid of. Number 1 is it's conjugated with sulfate. Number 2, it's conjugated with glucuronide. And then number 3 is it's metabolized by cytochrome P50. And that's what's shown here on the slide. So the first 2 processes that are listed here, they take up about 90% of the ingested dose of acetaminophen. So the first 2 bullet points account for 90% of how you detoxify Tylenol. The other 10% is handled by cytochrome P450. But the problem here is there's an intermediate of that reaction. Cytochrome P450 produces a metabolite that's the NAPQI. And this NAPQI is a hepatotoxin. It's toxic to hepatocytes. And when it's taken in appropriate doses, the 10% that goes to NAPQI, which then pairs with glutathione, is rendered safe. But if you take too much of the Tylenol and you overrun the system, you leave too much of the intermediate in the system for too long, and that's what causes this liver poisoning, okay? Forming necrotic tissue, which would be what type of necrosis in the liver? Which one? No? Who said coagulative? Coagulative necrosis in the liver, okay? Make sense? All right, you know what we're going to do is we're going to pick it up right here on Wednesday. We'll finish it out, and then we'll launch directly into acute inflammation, okay? It's a nice break. I don't want to rush it. We're finishing a couple minutes early, but it feels better this way to finish up on Wednesday than to try to rush through. Have a nice rest of your Monday.